huge gradient of mean annual air temperature then, all the way from 26 degrees to, oh, hold on. Are you guys seeing the presenter view right now?
We were seeing the presenter view, and now it went back to the. But now it doesn't seem. It doesn't seem as cropped anymore.
Temperature gradient right across this elevation gradient. And so we were interested then. This is a study led by Brian Enquist along the gradient. We were interested then in how does primary production, or GPP, vary along this large air temperature gradient. And so what we did that was rather unique in this study is we went to each of these sites and measured GPP using consistent methodology. And so often in our large-scale studies of plant productivity, a lot of the data are collected by many different investigators using different methods that are inconsistent. And so we then compile these data and use those in our analyses, which leads to a lot of noise in our analyses. And so what was unique about this study is everything was measured along this gradient using consistent sample design and also controlling for the age of the communities along this gradient. And so what we found here, this plot is a little bit, there's a lot going on here, so let me walk you through here. What we found is that temperature has a relatively minor influence on GPP across this gradient. And so on the y-axis, we have plotted here a biomass-corrected production rate. And so this is just GPP divided by the biomass of each plant community at each elevation. And this is plotted over this inverse air temperature. And so this is a little complicated. On the left here are actually warm air temperatures, and on the right are cool air temperatures. If you look at the top x-axis, you can actually see air temperature plotted on an absolute scale. So you can see 25 degrees Celsius is on the left and 10 degrees is on the right. And all of these points then, there's a point here for each site. And we can see then that, you know, as we move up the gradient or down in air temperature from right to left, we see that this biomass corrected production rate declines a little bit, but it's much less than we predicted for the kind of the biochemistry of photosynthesis, which we would expect then this line and all of these points to fall somewhere within this green area. And there's a whole bunch of theory behind this prediction, which I don't have time to get into here, but the main point here is that production is much less sensitive to temperature, and you know, the biochemistry of photosynthesis appears to be much less sensitive to temperature across this gradient than we predict based on the kinetics of photosynthesis across this air temperature gradient. Right, and so that's really strange because we know that at a leaf level, rates of photosynthesis vary quite strongly with leaf temperature. And so here we have a temperature response curve for leaf photosynthesis. So we have photosynthesis rate plotted over leaf temperature. And again, we see this kind of characteristic unimodal response curve where we increase to some maximum rate of photosynthesis at an optimal temperature, and then we decrease, right? And so the question is, why is temperature so important at the level of an individual leaf for carbon gain? But then if we move up to you know, the ecosystem level, we see that the rate of carbon gain, so GPP, is relatively insensitive. So why is this? One hypothesis then that has been emerging is it could be due to this kind of decoupling of leaf and air temperatures. Because as I'll show you next, leaf and air temperatures are generally not equal. So as ecologists, we often assume, you know, most of our studies assume that plants kind of just assume the ambient air temperature, and that all of their physiology and metabolism and the rates of their biochemistry is all kind of driven by the ambient air temperature. But, you know, even though we all assume this, we know that this is not correct. So this is a thermal camera image of a leaf here. And so the different colors correspond to different temperatures. And we can see that the cool color, so dark blue, is about 21 degrees Celsius. And the hot colors, the white here, is about 31 degrees Celsius. And we can see that this leaf here then, the difference between this leaf and its environment is about 10 degrees Celsius. So this leaf is actually operating at a much higher temperature than we would expect if we were just measuring the air temperature. So, okay, so this is a little bit cluttered. So I was really interested in kind of the differences then between leaf and air temperatures. And so what I did is I started digging back into the old literature, and I came across this paper by David Gates et al. From 1964. It was published in this very obscure journal. I think it had been cited like 7 times when I found it. And this had some really intriguing data in it. And so basically what they had was they had a growth chamber with a bunch of different plant species growing in it. So this is for 7 plant species. And they were able then to change the temperature of the air in the growth chamber from about 10 degrees Celsius to 55 degrees Celsius. And as they changed the air temperature, they had thermocouples, and they were able to measure the air temperature and the leaf temperature. And they just plotted then a very simple graph with leaf temperature over air temperature. And if leaf temperature equaled air temperature, all of the points should fall in this black 1-to-1 line, right? That's where leaf temperature equals air temperature. But what Gates et al. Instead found was that at low air temperatures, leaves were generally warmer than the air, and at higher temperatures, leaves were cooler than air. And so the implication of this then is this hidden text here that you can't see very well, but it means that leaf temperature is relatively stable relative to the air. And if we think about our temperature response curve, it means that then photosynthesis is operating generally closer to this optimal value of temperature where rates of photosynthesis are maximized, right? So this pattern then has potentially huge implications for our understanding of photosynthesis and higher level processes that are dependent upon photosynthesis. So we can actually predict then these patterns using leaf functional traits. And to do that, we can invoke this body of theory, which is called energy budget theory. And this is an example of an energy budget here, this equation. And this is a really powerful area of theory, which is really cool because it allows us to link climate variables, things like air temperature, solar radiation, humidity, wind velocity, etc., to link those with leaf functional traits, and in particular leaf thermal traits. So things like area, mass, width, the water content of leaves, stomatoconductance, specific heat, etc., absorptance, emissivity. And we can link these all within these equations that essentially account for energy fluxes in and out of a leaf. And so you can see this equation here. Each of these terms, the colored terms, correspond to different fluxes in the leaf. And so we have a net radiation flux, which is driving energy into the leaf. And then we have a convective flux term, which is usually a heat loss from the leaf to the air. And then we have a latent heat flux term resulting from transpiration, which occurs, kind of during photosynthesis. Or it's been thought to be a side effect of photosynthesis, but that may not be true in light of these kind of issues here. And then this whole thing, depending on how these fluxes balance out, you can have energy storage or temperature changes in the leaf. And so these fluxes then really determine the temperatures leaves are operating at. And this energy budget allows us to understand how that works and to link then mechanistically and quantitatively link leaf traits with climate to make predictions about leaf temperature. So let me back up a second. So this equation is very simple, but these fluxes are actually really complicated. And there's a million little sub-equations that plug into each other that you then will put into this simple equation here and then solve that in a way that you can work with. Here's a very simple example of a leaf energy balance equation. You can see that it allows us to predict leaf temperature here on the left-hand side. And that's given by the ambient air temperature plus a temperature increase term. This is driven primarily by solar radiation, but we also have several other met variables and leaf traits nested within this term. Okay, and then we have a temperature decrease term resulting from transpiration. And this is driven mainly by the vapor pressure deficit, but again, several other met variables and leaf traits. And so we can see that leaf temperature then, it will equal air temperature minus kind of like how the sun is heating up the leaf, sorry, plus how the sun is heating up the leaf minus how transpiration is then cooling the leaf. And so what we were then interested in doing is seeing if we could take this equation and if we could then predict the kind of, the response of an average leaf, the average leaf's temperature, how will that respond to variation in air temperature? And so what we did is we wanted this kind of global, just a typical average leaf. And so we actually went to the GlopNet leaf trait database. This is a database that has leaf trait data from around the world. And we were able to pull out data that we needed to parameterize this equation from around the globe. And we could also then go to gridded climate databases and pull out climate data for each of the sites where those traits were actually collected. So we could parameterize this equation for a typical average leaf and a typical average climate where it grows and make predictions about how leaf temperature should then change with air temperature. So the second part, so we can make predictions about leaf temperature, but then we also wanted to validate whether those predictions worked. And to do that, we used measured leaf and air temperature data. And this is an example from PFTC5 in China. This is Xiaoyao. This is an example of how those types of data are collected. So you can see we're up here at 4,100 meters at the top of the Mount Ganga elevation gradient in this beautiful setting here. And it's hard to see, but you can see a red digital thermometer in Xiao's hand. And this digital thermometer has two thermocouples on it connected to it. And we can use these two thermocouples. We can hold one to a leaf and one in the air. And we can measure simultaneously then differences in leaf and air temperature. And those are then the kind of data that we can use to assess how well our energy balance equations are predicting leaf temperature. Okay, so this is the actual evaluation of the model here. And again, in this figure, there's a lot going on, so I'll walk you through this one. So this figure is the same as Gates et al. Had plotted back in 1964. So we have leaf temperature here plotted over air temperature. We have a huge range of temperatures from about 0 degrees Celsius up to about 60 degrees Celsius. So those are probably larger ranges of temperature than you would ever experience, probably about as big as you would ever experience anywhere in the world where plants grow. The dashed line here is a one-to-one line. So this is where leaf and air temperatures are equal. And so again, if leaf temperatures are tracking air temperatures, all of these points should be along the dashed line. All of the points here, though, these are leaf temperature measurements. And we had, these are actually from the literature, and we had measurements from about 1,500 leaves from 184 different plant taxa. The different colors correspond to different plant growth forms. What we find is that if we just fit a regression line through here, so that's the black solid line, we find a slope of about 0.74. Okay, so it's shallower than a slope of 1, which suggests that yes, it does appear as though leaves globally are thermoregulating. That's empirical data. The pink line here, this is our prediction from energy balance theory. So I just want to stress that this pink line is not a regression of any sort. This is a prediction from first principles of energy balance, parameterized using GlopNet leaf trait database data. So this pink line is completely independent of any of the points plotted here. And we find that the energy balance theory also predicts this relationship that we empirically very well. And so this is really, really strong support, in my view, for this energy balance approach, where you can actually take independent data from two completely different approaches and get basically the same numbers. So then we have to wonder, why would leaves thermoregulate? Why does this happen? One current hypothesis is that this phenomenon helps to maximize carbon gain and fitness in variable environments. So to help explain this, we can take a look at leaf carbon economics theory. So this has a long history. These are really cool papers, and I recommend folks who are interested in this stuff to take a look at these papers. There's also a paper by Blonder et al., I think it's 2011, which is for some reason not listed here. That's another really good one. But this, all of this work can be summarized in a very simple equation here. And so essentially the whole point of this is to say that the lifetime carbon gain of a leaf should be greater or equal to 1. And we can, what that basically means is that G, so lifetime carbon gain, equals carbon return over carbon investment. And so the green colors here are terms that quantify carbon return, or kind of carbon gain via photosynthesis. And the brown terms here are the carbon investment in the leaf. And basically the whole point of this is that a leaf, should return more carbon than it takes to build. And the reason for this is that selection, natural selection should be selecting for this, because in order for a plant to grow and to have enough energy and to have enough energy to grow and reproduce, right, and to make seeds and to be, have offspring, it must be in a net positive carbon balance. So it has to be gaining more carbon than it takes to build a leaf, right? And all of the leaves on a plant should obey this rule. That's what leaf economics theory states. And there's different ways of calculating carbon return and investment. I'll just point out here that carbon investment is usually quantified by LMA. That's one of the main leaf traits we'll be measuring, along with rates of photosynthesis for carbon return, which is what we'll be measuring in group 2. So this has to be greater or equal to 1. Okay, so we can take a look at one of these terms here in more detail. So the lifetime carbon gain then equals the time averaged assimilation rate, or the rate of photosynthesis, multiplied by the leaf span, divided by the leaf mass per area. And so basically we can think of this like a bank account. So we have some cost of building something, right? And so we're in debt. When we build a leaf, the leaf is in debt. And so we have to pay that back, which is our assimilation rate. We have to pay back that carbon, and we have some length of period over which we can pay it back, okay? So we can multiply this through to get the lifetime carbon gain. And what's really cool about this is that this equation then tells us that natural selection can maximize carbon gain 3 ways. It can increase assimilation rate, can increase the leaf lifespan, or it can decrease leaf mass per area. Okay, and until now, it was thought that time averaged assimilation rates varied inversely with mass per area, and so it was unclear how you could simultaneously do all 3 of these things. But in the next slides here, I'll show you a new mechanism by which we think this might be possible. Okay, so here we have a temperature response curve again for a leaf. So rate of photosynthesis plotted over leaf temperature. If you think of a leaf that is sitting outside in the sun photosynthesizing, and it's windy and there's clouds coming by, you're gonna be, we kind of think leaf temperature is static or stable, but in reality, leaf temperature is highly variable and it's changing all the time. And if you were to put a thermal camera out on a plant canopy, you would see that it's constantly changing in air temperatures. You can see wind gusts go by, and it's quite amazing. So we're varying along this axis. And so what that means, because of this temperature response curve, it means we're also varying, we're kind of moving then along this curve through time. And our photosynthesis rates are then also changing. And so if we're down here, moving down here, we have very low rates of photosynthesis, but if we're moving up here, we have high rates of photosynthesis. The variation in temperature then is governed by a leaf functional trait called the thermal time constant. And this is actually a composite trait which combines several other key functional traits, things like area, mass, leaf dry matter content. It combines these into a single trait that governs rates of temperature change. So the way that I try to explain this is using the example of an adobe house. And so on the left, you can see there's a bunch of folks here building this adobe house. And I use this example because I was living in the American Southwest for quite a long time, and these houses are very common there because we have very large diurnal temperature changes. So, in the summer, it can get to like 35 degrees Celsius during the day, and kind of in the heat of the day, but in the evening, it can cool down to 25 degrees Celsius or 20 degrees Celsius. So really large diurnal temperature changes. And you can see that these folks are putting all this effort and work into building these really expensive, thick walls. The reason that we build these houses in the Southwest is because they have very large time constants. They're just so massive, right? There's so much mass there that when you impose a temperature change in the air, these walls respond very slowly. And so during the heat of the day in the Southwest, it might be 35 degrees Celsius outside. The walls and the interior of the house may only be 27 degrees Celsius. And then during the evening, when it cools down and it gets cold outside, these walls also then retain their heat, okay? And so it might be 20 degrees outside, but it could be like 27 degrees inside. And so these expensive thick walls have a buffering effect on temperature, which is driven by this thermal time constant. We can contrast that with a sheet metal pole barn, which has very inexpensive thin walls. There's like nobody working here, right? Because it's so easy to build. They're out having tea. These walls have very small time constants. So they respond almost instantaneously to temperature changes. And so this analogy, we can then apply this also to leaves. So we can consider a couple examples here, rhododendron and robinia. So rhododendron has, in terms of carbon and biomass, has relatively expensive thick leaves. We can calculate out the time constants, and these are large time constants. So rhododendron responds relatively slowly to temperature changes. And robinia has inexpensive thin leaves that have small time constants, and so they respond relatively rapidly to temperature changes. So we can see how the traits of these leaves then have an implication for the temperature dynamics of these leaves. The temperature dynamics then have implications for the rates of physiology, okay? And so we can consider, let's consider rhododendron here. And if we just imagine that it has this temperature response curve for photosynthesis, this orange solid line, and the range of temperature variation is given by this orange region here. If we then kind of average photosynthesis through time, we would find the average rate of photosynthesis is this orange dashed line, okay? Let's now consider robinia, which has these really cheap leaves, right? That just kind of instantaneously change with air temperature. It's gonna have a much larger range of temperature variation. So now I'm indicating the range of temperature variation by this blue region, right? And if we assume that robinia has this same temperature response curve, we're now gonna be moving over a much larger range of photosynthesis, which overall will give us a lower rate of time averaged photosynthesis. But what if, so that's strange, these two leaves have very different values of kind of time average photosynthesis. And so why would that be if leaf economics theory is trying to maximize carbon gain, right? So what we are proposing here is, what if Robinia could actually there could also be selection on the thermal breadth of the temperature response curve for Robinia. Okay, so it's not only the thermal traits of the leaf that control temperature that can be under selection, but also the biochemistry of photosynthesis could be under selection. And if that were the case, both of these leaves then could be photosynthesizing at more or less maximum rates. Okay, and so this actually, there's a bunch of mathematics under the hood here, which we don't have time to get into today. But we can actually mathematically then show that these thermal time constants should vary inversely with the breadth of photosynthesis. And remember, the breadth of photosynthesis is how narrow or wide this curve is. So we were able to mathematically propose this hypothesis. We then went, and this is, sorry, that was the old photo. What we then did is we went to the field and we grabbed a bunch of leaves. So this is a photo from the Plant Functional Traits Course 1 on Mount Ganga, China. And you can see we have a Licor 6400. So this is way back in the day when we were using these 6400 XTs still with these awesome green LEDs that turn black in the sun. We were using one of these, and we could collect these turfs from along the elevation gradient and bring them back to the lab and hook up a leaf into the chamber. And there's some Peltier devices in here that allow us to change the temperature of the leaf across a very large range. And then at each temperature, we can measure photosynthesis. And we get these beautiful curves like we see here on this beautiful picture. So on the y-axis is photosynthesis, right? And on the x-axis is temperature. And we see this beautiful unimodal temperature response curve. And we can then quantify the thermal breadth, or how wide is that curve. We can then take each leaf here and we can send it inside to the lab, where we then measure all of the leaf functional traits that we need to calculate our thermal time constant. So this is a photo, this is from Luke Molly, photo that he took in Svalbard a couple summers ago on PFTC5. Okay, so we can measure the thermal breadth and the traits, and we can then plot the thermal breadth of photosynthesis over this time constant. So we plotted it both for literature data, but as well as data that we collected. And we see that we do see this predicted inverse relationship in both data sets. Okay, and so this is supportive of this hypothesis that leaves can simultaneously maximize time average assimilation while minimizing leaf mass per area in order to maximize leaf carbon gain. Okay, and if we then look at this thermal time constant here, it's the second to bottom one here, we see that this actually falls along this carbon economics, or this leaf economics spectrum, right? So over on the left we have slow leaves, like this pinyon pine here, and over on the right we have fast leaves like this blade of grass. I don't know my grass species. So from slow to fast, and so this thermal time constant, we have long, stable, in terms of temperature dynamics, long and stable leaves on the slow side, and short and unstable leaves on the fast side. And that for the photosynthetic breath, we have small breaths and photosynthetically unstable leaves on the left, and large breaths and photosynthetically stable leaves on the right. Okay, so just to summarize then, so the main points here, I hope I convinced you in the first part of the talk here that leaf temperatures almost never equal air temperatures. Okay, and so we can look at theory and data across the board. Almost never will you find leaf and air temperatures that are equal. Instead, we tend to find that leaves appear to thermoregulate. It appears as though this thermoregulation may actually originate from adaptive thermal traits, right? And so selection on leaf economics in order to maximize carbon gain. So one of the huge implications here that we're still trying to understand how to implement is that we really need to start in our further studies as we all move on. We really need to start using measured plant temperatures and not only air temperatures, especially if these are, you know, diverging largely. Okay, and then finally, linking, you know, energetics, traits, and scaling is a very promising area of work, and I think if we focus here, will help us develop a more mechanistic and predictive ecology. So that's it for me. I guess if there's any questions, I'm happy to try and answer any of those if we have time.